In the sweltering heat of August 1895, the newly established city of Boise, Idaho, harbored secrets beneath its ambitious facade. The western expansion had brought fortune seekers and families alike to this remote valley. But with prosperity came the inevitable shadows of human desperation. Among the hastily constructed buildings that lined the dusty streets stood the Meridian Foundling House, a somber brick structure that served as refuge for the territory's unwanted children. The institution had been founded 3 years prior by Cornelius Whitmore, a wealthy mine owner whose own childless marriage had inspired his charitable endeavors. Built on the outskirts of town, where the sagebrush met civilization, the Foundling House rose like a fortress against the endless Idaho sky. Its Gothic Revival architecture seemed oddities in this frontier setting, with pointed arches and heavy stonework that spoke of Eastern sensibilities transplanted to Western soil. Mrs. Adelaide Crane served as the house's matron, a stern woman in her 50s whose previous experience managing orphanages in Chicago had prepared her for the challenges of frontier child welfare. Her staff consisted of 3 younger women, all unmarried and dedicated to the cause of caring for society's most vulnerable. The daily routine was rigid and purposeful, designed to instill discipline and moral character in children who had experienced life's earliest cruelties. The basement of the Foundling House served multiple practical functions in the building's economy of space and resources. It housed the kitchen's cold storage, the laundry facilities, and workshops where older children learned trades that might serve them in adulthood. The thick stone walls kept the lower level cool during Idaho's harsh summers, making it a natural gathering place when temperatures soared above bearable limits in the upper floors. During the summer of 1895, 17 children called the Meridian Foundling House their temporary home, ranging in age from infants to adolescents approaching their majority. Most had arrived following family tragedies common to frontier life, mining accidents, disease outbreaks, or the simple economic realities that made child-rearing impossible for struggling families. The older children helped care for the younger ones, creating a complex social hierarchy within the institution's walls. The town of Boise itself was experiencing rapid growth during this period as the completion of the Oregon Short Line Railroad had connected the territory to broader commercial networks. Silver and gold mines in the surrounding mountains brought steady streams of hopeful prospectors, while agricultural development in the valley attracted families seeking fertile land. This prosperity, however, created stark contrasts between the wealthy mine owners and the desperate poor who sought any opportunity for survival. Local records from the period indicate that the Meridian Foundling House maintained detailed documentation of its residents, their origins, and their eventual placements with adoptive families or employers. These meticulous records, kept in Mrs. Crane's careful handwriting, would later prove crucial to understanding the events that unfolded during that oppressive August. The ledgers noted not only practical information, but also behavioral observations and health concerns that affected each child's daily routine. The physical isolation of the Foundling House contributed to its atmosphere of self-contained existence, where the outside world seemed distant and irrelevant to daily survival. Surrounded by miles of high desert terrain, punctuated by distant mountains, the institution operated according to its own rhythms and necessities. Supply wagons arrived weekly from town, but otherwise the inhabitants existed in relative solitude, creating their own small society governed by strict rules and limited resources. Mrs. Crane had implemented a system of education that combined basic literacy with practical skills training. Recognizing that most of her charges would need to support themselves through manual labor rather than academic pursuits. The basement workshops buzzed with activity as children learned carpentry, sewing, and food preservation techniques that would serve them well in frontier communities. These activities created a constant hum of purposeful noise throughout the lower level of the building. The summer heat of 1895 proved particularly brutal, with temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit during daylight hours. The thick brick walls of the Foundling House provided some relief, but the upper floors became nearly uninhabitable during the afternoon hours. Consequently, much of the daily routine shifted to the cooler basement level, where children gathered for lessons, meals, and evening activities in the relative comfort provided by the Earth's natural insulation. As August progressed, subtle changes began to manifest in the Foundling House's established routines and rhythms. Mrs. Crane noted in her daily journal that several of the younger children had begun displaying unusual behaviors, including reluctance to venture into certain areas of the basement and complaints of strange sounds echoing through the stone corridors. These observations, initially dismissed as typical childhood imagination heightened by the oppressive heat, would later assume more ominous significance. The staff noticed that the children had begun congregating in specific areas of the basement, avoiding the storage rooms and workshops that had previously been centers of activity. When questioned about their preferences, the children offered vague explanations about cold spots and funny echoes that made them uncomfortable. Mrs. Crane documented these complaints with characteristic thoroughness, though she attributed them to the natural acoustics of the stone-walled basement and the children's desire to find the coolest possible spaces. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the town's physician who made weekly visits to the Foundling House, observed during his rounds that several children showed signs of disturbed sleep and decreased appetite. He prescribed additional rest periods and lighter meals to combat the effects of the heat, but privately expressed concern about the children's collective unease. His medical notes from this period describe a general state of heightened anxiety among the residents, though he could identify no specific medical cause. The Foundling House's proximity to Boise's rapidly expanding cemetery had never been considered problematic until that August debut, when several children began asking questions about the burial grounds visible from the upper floor windows. Mrs. Crane found herself fielding inquiries about death and burial practices with increasing frequency, as the children seemed preoccupied with mortality in ways that exceeded normal childhood curiosity. These conversations, while not alarming in themselves, contributed to an atmosphere of unease that permeated the institution. Local newspaper archives from the Boise Statesman reveal that August 1895 was marked by an unusual number of mining accidents in the surrounding hills, resulting in several families losing their primary breadwinners. The Foundling House received 4 new residents during this period, children whose fathers had perished in cave-ins or equipment failures that plagued the hastily constructed mining operations. These arrivals, traumatized by recent losses, added to the overall emotional tension within the institution's walls. The established residents of the Foundling House had developed their own informal social structures and territorial arrangements, particularly in the basement areas where they spent increasing amounts of time. The arrival of new children disrupted these patterns, creating friction and confusion that Mrs. Crane struggled to manage effectively. Her journal entries from this period reflect growing concern about maintaining order and discipline among children who seemed increasingly agitated and unpredictable in their behaviors. By the second week of August, the strange behaviors exhibited by the Foundling House children had evolved from mere discomfort to something approaching collective anxiety. Mrs. Crane's meticulous daily records document a pattern of sleep disturbances that seemed to spread from child to child like a contagious condition. The younger residents, particularly those between the ages of 5 and 8, reported difficulty falling asleep and frequent nightmares that left them exhausted and fearful during daylight hours. The basement level, once a refuge from the oppressive heat, had become a source of increasing unease for both children and staff members. Several of the older girls, typically responsible for supervising younger children during basement activities, requested permission to conduct their duties on the main floor despite the uncomfortable temperatures. When pressed for explanations, they spoke hesitantly of sounds that seemed to emerge from the stone walls themselves, describing voices too faint to understand, but distinct enough to create persistent anxiety. Martha Henley, the youngest member of Mrs. Crane's staff, documented her own experiences in a personal diary that would later provide crucial insight into the developing situation. Her entries describe an oppressive atmosphere in the basement that seemed to intensify during the evening hours, when children gathered for their final meal of the day. She noted that conversations seemed to die away unexpectedly, as if the children were straining to hear something beyond the range of adult perception. The Foundling House's daily routine had always included periods of enforced quiet time, designed to provide respite from the constant activity required to manage 17 children in close quarters. However, these quiet periods had taken on an unsettling quality, as the children appeared to be listening intently rather than resting peacefully. Mrs. Crane observed that the youngest residents would often tilt their heads toward the basement walls, their expressions suggesting concentration rather than relaxation during these mandated rest periods. Dr. Morrison's weekly visits became more frequent as August progressed, prompted by Mrs. Crane's growing concerns about the children's collective state of mind. His examination notes described symptoms that defied conventional medical explanation: elevated heart rates during periods of apparent calm, dilated pupils in adequately lit spaces, and a general hypervigilance that seemed disproportionate to any identifiable external threats. These physiological responses suggested genuine fear rather than childhood imagination or attention-seeking behavior. The older children, those approaching their teenage years, began exhibiting protective behaviors toward their younger counterparts that exceeded normal institutional dynamics. They formed informal guard groups during basement activities, positioning themselves between the youngest children and specific areas of the lower level that seemed to generate the most anxiety. This self-organizing behavior impressed Mrs. Crane with its maturity, while simultaneously alarming her with its apparent necessity. Temperature readings taken by the staff revealed anomalous cold spots in various basement locations, particularly in the storage areas and abandoned chambers that had been sealed off due to structural concerns. These temperature variations defied logical explanation, as the basement's stone construction should have maintained relatively consistent conditions throughout the lower level. The cold spots seemed to shift location unpredictably, appearing in different areas from day to day without any identifiable pattern. The children's appetite, already diminished by the oppressive heat, declined further as their anxiety increased throughout the month. Meal times, traditionally periods of relative normalcy and social interaction, became tense affairs marked by sudden silences and collective attention to sounds that adults could not detect. Mrs. Crane noted that the children seemed to eat hurriedly, as if eager to conclude their time in the basement dining area and return to the upper floors. Nighttime supervision, always challenging in an institution housing children from diverse and often traumatic backgrounds, became increasingly difficult as August progressed. The staff reported that children who had previously slept soundly began experiencing night terrors that seemed to spread from room to room like wildfire. These episodes typically began in the early morning hours, when the building's thick walls should have provided the most effective insulation from external disturbances that might trigger such responses. Mrs. Crane's correspondence with the board of directors reveals her growing frustration with the situation's inexplicable nature and her uncertainty about appropriate interventions. Her letters describe a gradual erosion of the institutional routine that had previously maintained order and purpose within the Foundling House walls. The children's collective unease had begun to affect staff morale and efficiency, creating a cycle of anxiety that seemed to feed upon itself with each passing day. The basement workshops, once centers of productive activity and skill development, were gradually abandoned as both children and staff found reasons to avoid extended periods in the lower level. Carpentry projects remained unfinished. Sewing work was relocated to less suitable spaces on the main floor, and food preservation activities were postponed despite the practical necessity of preparing for winter months. This disruption of normal routines had economic implications that concerned the institution's administrators and donors. Local residents began to notice changes in the Foundling House's external appearance and activity patterns, though few understood the internal dynamics driving these modifications. The children's outdoor play periods became more frequent and extended, as staff members sought to provide relief from the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to concentrate within the building's walls. Neighbors observed that the usual sounds of children's voices and activities emanated more often from the grounds surrounding the building rather than from within the structure itself. The town's religious community, always interested in the welfare of orphaned children, offered various forms of assistance and intervention during this period. Reverend Thomas Blackwood from the Methodist Church proposed conducting prayer services within the Foundling House, while Father O'Sullivan from the Catholic Mission suggested blessing the building and its inhabitants. Mrs. Crane, while appreciative of these offers, hesitated to introduce religious elements that might further agitate children already in a heightened state of anxiety. Historical weather records indicate that the third week of August brought no relief from the oppressive heat that had dominated the summer months, with temperatures continuing to exceed normal ranges for the region. However, the children's behavior suggested that their distress had transcended simple discomfort with climatic conditions and had evolved into something more complex and troubling. The correlation between temperature and anxiety had broken down, leaving staff members without a clear understanding of causation or effective remediation strategies. The Foundling House's isolation, once considered an advantage for maintaining institutional discipline and focus, now seemed to contribute to the developing crisis by limiting access to outside perspectives and resources. The nearest similar institution was located in Salt Lake City, more than 300 miles distant, making consultations with experienced colleagues difficult and time-consuming. Mrs. Crane found herself relying increasingly on her own judgment and instincts to navigate circumstances that exceeded her previous experience managing troubled children. The basement's stone construction, admired by visitors for its durability and craftsmanship, began to assume more ominous qualities as the children's fears focused increasingly on the building's structural elements. The thick walls that provided insulation from summer heat also created acoustic properties that amplified and distorted sounds in unpredictable ways. What had once been considered architectural advantages now seemed to contribute to an atmosphere that supported rather than dispelled the children's growing collective anxiety about their environment. The fourth week of August marked a critical escalation in the mysterious circumstances plaguing the Meridian Foundling House, as the children's whispered conversations began to reveal specific details about their shared experiences. Mrs. Crane discovered that the younger residents had developed their own vocabulary to describe phenomena that adults could neither perceive nor understand, using terms like the cold voices and the waiting ones, with matter-of-fact certainty that chilled her despite the oppressive summer heat. 7-year-old Timothy Morrison, the youngest of Dr. Morrison's patients at the Foundling House, became an unwitting spokesman for the children's collective experience when he approached Mrs. Crane with detailed descriptions of conversations he claimed to overhear in the basement storage areas. His account, recorded verbatim in Mrs. Crane's journal, described voices that spoke in hushed tones about the children who stayed and the room that remembers, phrases that seemed beyond his normal vocabulary and comprehension level. The staff's attempts to rationalize these reports through conventional explanations became increasingly strained as more children corroborated similar experiences with remarkable consistency. The voices, according to multiple witnesses, seemed to emanate from specific locations within the basement walls, particularly near the sealed chambers that had been deemed structurally unsound during the building's construction. These areas had been walled off with newer masonry that contrasted visibly with the original stonework, creating natural focal points for the children's attention and anxiety. Mrs. Crane's investigation into the Foundling House's construction history revealed several disturbing gaps in the available documentation, suggesting that certain aspects of the building's development had been deliberately obscured or inadequately recorded. The original architectural plans showed basement chambers that did not correspond to the current layout, implying that modifications had been made during construction without proper documentation. These discrepancies raised questions about what might lie behind the sealed walls that had become centers of the children's fearful attention. The children's sleep patterns deteriorated further during this period, with night terrors occurring with such frequency that normal rest became virtually impossible for residents and staff alike. The episodes typically began around 3 o'clock in the morning, when the building's thermal mass had finally begun to cool from the previous day's heat. Multiple children would wake simultaneously, often calling out names that Mrs. Crane did not recognize as belonging to any current or former residents of the institution. Dr. Morrison's medical examinations during this period documented physical symptoms that suggested genuine trauma responses rather than collective hysteria or attention-seeking behavior. Several children exhibited stress-related conditions, including rapid weight loss, chronic fatigue, and nervous tremors that persisted even during periods of apparent calm. These physiological indicators convinced him that the children were experiencing genuine distress, regardless of the actual nature of its underlying causes. The basement's temperature anomalies became more pronounced and predictable as August progressed, with cold spots consistently appearing in specific locations that corresponded to the children's reports of vocal phenomena. Staff members confirmed these temperature variations using mercury thermometers, documenting differences of up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit between affected areas and the surrounding basement spaces. These measurements provided objective validation for at least some aspects of the children's subjective experiences. Mrs. Crane's efforts to maintain normal institutional routines faced increasing resistance from the children themselves, who had developed their own survival strategies for dealing with their perceived threats. They moved through the building in groups, avoided certain basement areas entirely, and created elaborate systems of signals and warnings to alert each other to potentially dangerous situations. This self-organizing behavior demonstrated remarkable sophistication while simultaneously indicating the depth of their collective fear. The Foundling House's board of directors, informed of the developing situation through Mrs. Crane's increasingly urgent correspondence, authorized an emergency inspection of the building's structural integrity and safety systems. The examination, conducted by a team of engineers from Boise's growing construction industry, revealed several concerning features of the basement's design and execution. The sealed chambers showed evidence of hasty construction and inadequate ventilation, suggesting they had been closed off for reasons beyond simple structural concerns. local historical research conducted at Mrs. Crane's request uncovered troubling information about the land's previous use before the foundling house's construction. County records indicated that the site had formerly contained a smaller structure that had burned under mysterious circumstances in 1889, claiming the lives of several individuals whose identities remained unclear in official documentation. The fire's cause had never been definitively established, and the victims had been buried in unmarked graves somewhere on the property before construction began. The children's collective behavior evolved during this period to include protective rituals and practices that seemed to emerge spontaneously from their shared understanding of their situation. They began arranging sleeping areas to avoid specific locations, created buddy systems for venturing into necessary basement spaces, and developed coded language for discussing their experiences in the presence of adults. These adaptations demonstrated both their resourcefulness and the genuineness of their perceived threat. Staff members reported their own unusual experiences during this time, though their accounts remained more tentative and qualified than the children's direct statements. Martha Henley documented feelings of unease in certain basement areas, while cook Sarah Matthews noted that food stored in specific locations seemed to spoil more rapidly than normal. These adult observations, while less dramatic than the children's reports, provided additional evidence that something unusual was occurring within the foundling house's walls. The institution's daily operations had become increasingly dysfunctional as normal routines collapsed under the weight of collective anxiety and disrupted sleep patterns. Educational activities were suspended, meal preparation became haphazard, and basic maintenance tasks were neglected as staff members focused their attention on crisis management and child supervision. The foundling house's mission of providing stable care and moral instruction had been compromised by circumstances that defied conventional understanding and intervention. Dr. Morrison's consultation with colleagues in Salt Lake City and Denver yielded no useful precedents for dealing with collective psychological disturbances among institutionalized children. The medical literature contained few references to similar cases, and those that existed offered conflicting theories about causation and treatment approaches. The isolation that had once seemed advantageous for the foundling house now became a liability, as expert assistance remained distant and difficult to obtain in crisis situations. The children's reports began to include specific details about the identities and circumstances of the voices they claimed to hear, describing individuals who seemed to be former residents of some previous institution or dwelling on the same site. These accounts, while varying in details, shared common elements that suggested either shared delusion or genuine perception of phenomena beyond normal adult awareness. The consistency of these reports across multiple witnesses made simple dismissal increasingly difficult for the rational-minded staff members. The basement's acoustic properties, always unusual due to its stone construction and sealed chambers, seemed to amplify and distort sounds in ways that could potentially explain some of the children's experiences through natural phenomena. However, the specific nature of their reports suggested perception of organized communication rather than random acoustic effects. The voices they described conveyed information and emotions that implied conscious intention rather than mere environmental noise or echoes. Mrs. Crane's journal entries from this period reflect her growing conviction that the situation had progressed beyond the scope of normal institutional management and required intervention from authorities with specialized knowledge of unusual circumstances. Her professional training and years of experience had not prepared her for dealing with collective psychological disturbances that seemed to have objective correlates in the physical environment. The foundling house had become a laboratory for phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of childhood psychology and institutional management. The final week of August brought revelations that would forever alter the understanding of events at the Meridian Foundling House, beginning with the discovery of structural anomalies that had remained hidden since the building's construction. Mrs. Crane's persistent inquiries into the basement's sealed chambers finally yielded permission from the board of directors to conduct a thorough investigation. Despite concerns about potentially disturbing whatever stability remained in the institution's increasingly fragile environment, the structural engineers who had conducted the earlier safety inspection returned with more sophisticated equipment and authorization to breach the sealed walls that had become focal points of the children's fears. Their preliminary work revealed that the chambers had been closed off not due to structural instability, as originally assumed, but to conceal spaces that contained evidence of the previous structure's violent destruction. Behind the newer masonry lay rooms filled with charred debris and personal effects that had survived the 1889 fire. Among the recovered items were fragments of children's clothing, toys, and educational materials that suggested the previous building had also served as some form of institutional care facility. More disturbing were the remnants of official records and correspondence that indicated this earlier institution had experienced its own series of unexplained difficulties before its ultimate destruction. The parallels between historical and contemporary circumstances were too numerous and specific to dismiss as mere coincidence or imagination. The children's reactions to the unsealing of the basement chambers proved both vindication and escalation of their previous distress, as they claimed the voices had become more insistent and clear following the structural modifications. Their reports now included specific names and biographical details about former residents of the earlier institution. Information that subsequent research would confirm through church records and cemetery documentation. The accuracy of these details exceeded what could reasonably be attributed to childhood imagination or overheard adult conversations. Dr. Morrison's examination of the recovered materials revealed evidence of a tuberculosis outbreak that had claimed multiple lives at the previous institution during the winter of 1888-1889. Medical records discovered among the debris documented a quarantine situation that had isolated the building's residents from outside assistance for several months before the fire occurred. The timing and circumstances suggested that the fire might have been deliberately set to prevent further spread of the disease, though official investigations had reached no definitive conclusions. Mrs. Crane's research into local cemetery records confirmed the burial of 7 children from the previous institution in unmarked graves on the Foundling House property itself. Their bodies interred hastily following the fire before proper identification could be completed. The graves' locations corresponded precisely to areas where the current children had reported the strongest manifestations of unusual phenomena, providing geographical correlation for their experiences that extended beyond the building's interior spaces. The children's collective behavior shifted dramatically following these discoveries, as their previous fear evolved into something approaching protective concern for the historical residents they claimed to perceive. They began leaving small offerings of food and toys in the basement areas where voices had been reported, treating these spaces with reverence rather than terror. This transformation suggested that their experiences involved perception of specific individuals rather than generic supernatural threats. Staff members found themselves documenting increasingly complex interactions between current residents and their reported historical counterparts, as the children described detailed conversations about daily life, family histories, and the circumstances surrounding the earlier institution's destruction. These accounts provided information about frontier orphan care practices that proved accurate when verified through surviving official records, demonstrating knowledge that exceeded the current residents' normal educational exposure and life experience. The unsealed chambers yielded additional evidence of the previous institution's final days, including a journal kept by its matron that described circumstances remarkably similar to those experienced at the current foundling house. Her entries documented collective anxiety among the children, reports of unusual phenomena, and growing concern about factors that seemed to exceed normal institutional challenges. The parallel experiences across different time periods and populations suggested patterns that transcended individual psychology or environmental factors. Local newspaper archives from 1889 revealed that the previous institution's destruction had been preceded by weeks of unusual activity and community concern about the welfare of its residents. Reports from neighbors described sounds of children's voices emanating from the building at all hours, even during periods when the facility was known to be under strict quarantine. These historical accounts provided contemporary verification for the types of phenomena currently being reported by the Foundling House residents. The board of directors faced an unprecedented decision regarding the Foundling House's future operations, as the discoveries had created both practical and ethical dilemmas about continuing to house children in a location associated with historical tragedy. Public awareness of the situation had grown despite efforts to maintain confidentiality, creating pressure for transparent resolution while protecting the current residents' welfare and privacy. The institution's mission of child welfare seemed to require acknowledgement of factors that challenged conventional understanding. Dr. Morrison's final medical report documented his conclusion that the children's experiences, regardless of their ultimate nature or explanation, had produced genuine psychological benefits rather than trauma as the situation evolved toward resolution. Their initial fear had transformed into something approaching healing, as they seemed to derive comfort from their role as witnesses to and advocates for historical residents who had been forgotten by official records and community memory. The Foundling House's operations were temporarily suspended at the end of August, while alternative arrangements were made for the current residents, though several of the older children requested permission to remain and assist in the ongoing historical investigation. Their intimate knowledge of the reported phenomena made them valuable witnesses for researchers attempting to document and understand the full scope of the unusual circumstances that had unfolded during that oppressive summer month. Mrs. Crane's final journal entry regarding the August events reflected her transformed understanding of institutional childcare and the complex factors that could influence the welfare of vulnerable populations. Her experience had challenged fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between past and present, individual and collective experience, and the nature of childhood perception and resilience. The basement, where children had whispered with history, would remain a subject of investigation and speculation for years to come. The Meridian Foundling House was eventually reopened under new management, with modifications to its basement spaces that acknowledged both practical needs and historical circumstances, though it never again housed the same number of residents as during that memorable August. The children who had shared those experiences carried their memories into adulthood, some eventually returning as adults to share their recollections with researchers investigating frontier institutional care and the complex legacies of historical trauma. Local historical societies eventually installed a memorial marker on the Foundling House grounds, commemorating the 7 children who had perished in the 1889 fire, providing formal recognition for lives that had been forgotten in official records but preserved in the collective memory of those who claimed to have heard their voices in the basement where the children whisper. The marker serves as reminder that institutional care extends beyond the living, to encompass responsibility for preserving the dignity and memory of all who have sought refuge within protective walls.